from my perspective, if we're thinking about salivary cancers, research really should be a central part of the management of patients actually throughout the pathway. I think for all kind of rare cancers, we know that there isn't necessarily clearly defined treatment, so there is what I think might be considered an acceptable standard of care, and there are guidelines, but then guidelines are quite divergent. As we know, there's sort of multiple sets of guidelines that all sort of potentially conflict with each other. And if we're going to improve things for patients, the first thing is we need to actually know what guidelines are being followed, what treatments are actually being given to patients. And this applies not just in the drug therapy setting, I think in the surgical setting. I mean, we know that surgery is right for patients who have operable disease. I don't know much about surgery, but Jim will tell you that there are different types of surgery, and the question is what surgery is right. And it's when you take one lymph node out or a whole neck's worth of lymph nodes out. It's whether you do the biggest possible operation or the smallest possible operation, and then there's a whole kind of area of uncertainty about patient group who have sort of inoperable disease, but actually different surgeons will not necessarily agree about what is operable and what is not operable, and that comes down to different things. One is a technical question, so some surgeons will just say this technically is not operable, and then other surgeons might say actually technically we think it is. And then there's the patient perspective. So they might say this is technically operable, but it is not the right thing to operate for weighing up the harms and the benefit. But that conversation between the surgical team and the patient could yield different opinions depending on different patients and different surgical teams. So I think it's really obvious in the drug therapy setting that we don't, if for most settings in salivary gland cancer, there is no defined standard because the trials haven't yet been done. But I actually think in the gold standard setting of surgery, there really is a role for research, and patients arguably should all have data collected prospectively in what is essentially a research study, finding out what are we actually doing and what are the outcomes. And once you know what we're doing and what the outcomes are, that's when you can then say, okay, are we doing the right thing? Can we improve on it? And can we measure how the outcomes change? So I actually think research throughout the patient's journey is appropriate. I'm going to talk now more about one other thing about research. So we're talking about clinical trials, and I'm going to go through a clinical trials finder just to sort of give people a bit of, empower individuals to look themselves really and inform conversations with their clinical team or just for themselves to know. One other word about research. So there's just different types of research. Jim presented some really interesting research on patient blood samples and stool samples. So you might call that translational research. You get a whole lot of patients, we know what treatment they've had and we know what the outcomes are, and you've collected some biological samples and you're studying them. Then you've got a whole other kind of research which you might call laboratory research or preclinical research. So this is a huge area of research that is very expensive and very time consuming and is often hidden from patients because it's not directly got patients involved in it. But that area, this sort of basic science research or preclinical research, is when you can test or ask questions, test hypotheses. Does this drug work in adenoid cystic carcinoma in the lab, say? And you can run a whole load of experiments without the human being involved. There's a benefit to that, so that you're refining down the questions for when you're offering trials to patients. So you're not just saying, there's 1,000 drugs out there, let's go through them one by one, or there's 1,000 bits of biology, which one is the one that's going to be that will work if we modulate it in this disease. You find out in the lab what you think is most likely to work, and then test it in a patient. And when we look at research in, say, I always use breast cancer as my example, maybe I'll need to stop that. But if you look at breast cancer, it's just the polar opposite of salivary cancer in terms of the amount of attention it gets and the amount of research funding it gets. And they have just got literally over 1,000 times the amount of research funding and activity and information that informs their clinical trials. And we know that outcomes in breast cancer have changed so massively. Since I started in oncology in 2008, breast cancer, people who have metastatic breast cancer, the survival then, average survival was about 2 years. It's now almost 10 years. And that's the average in metastatic breast cancer. It's completely transformed. And the only thing that changes our practice is research. So opinion does not change our practice. So getting a whole load of people in a room and then someone saying, I think we should do this, it doesn't change what we do. And how does research change our practice? Finally, I get there, through clinical trials. So we have to do trials on patients to show that treatment approach A versus treatment approach B, one is better than the other. And then it's this incremental process where you say, this is our current standard defined through, we've done our real world data collection. It says we know what our standard is. And if you don't know, that's a real problem for trials, because then when we try and go to healthcare systems to say, this should be our new treatment, we get told, you didn't compare it to the current standard practice, therefore we don't know whether this really is better. But that's what you do. You define your standard, you test your new approach against it, you demonstrate whether or not it is better, and if it is, the healthcare community accepts that, moves with it, changes practice, and that becomes a new standard arm against something else. So that's kind of a bit of a preamble about different types of research, and then now on to clinical trials. So clinical trials, so this is, as Emma was talking about, this is research in patients. Clinical trials aren't just drugs, but I'm a medical oncologist and I'll probably focus a little bit more now on the drug perspective. But bear in mind, you can have a clinical trial of a device, of a surgical procedure, of radiotherapy. So all elements of care can have clinical trials. But for the purpose of the next few minutes, I'll talk more about drugs. So just maybe when people are thinking about this and trying to think, how does this apply to me? And it's something Emma's kind of said about, what motivates people to go into trials of drug therapies. So the motivation for patients normally to go into trials is if they have cancer that has come back, that has either no standard treatment, or the standard treatment is one of the arms in the trial. So patients who don't have evidence of cancer and are on surveillance following their primary treatment, for instance, they're not really the drug trials that are kind of actively recruiting in salivary cancers. So what I'll do is I'll go through this website, and what I would hope is that people can actually feel comfortable even to do it themselves. So this is Clin.Trials.Gov. Put that into Google, you get this page. This is it's pretty accurate. There can be a bit of a delay in terms of it being updated, but essentially this is a global register of clinical trials. And so you can search it and you can ask the question, what clinical trials might there be available for me, and where are they in the world? And in fact, where are they in the country? It lists sort of actively recruiting centres. And so I'll just talk you through the homepage, and then we'll look at some of the ways of narrowing it down. But essentially, we've already done this before. Look. So if you put adenoid cystic carcinoma into the condition and click search, it will give you some results. And what you can see is it then shows actually 167 studies come up. I mean, that's actually a large number, but when you look at that, you can narrow it down by active studies. It will be, it won't be that number in total. But that's one way of looking. Now, before we move on to look at it and narrowing it down, just bear in mind, like anything, you get out of it what you put into it. So I actually think clinical trials recruiting patients with adenoid cystic carcinoma, they will probably pretty much all come up if you put adenoid cystic carcinoma in. But if you're a patient with another type of salivary gland cancer, then the question is, what do you put in here? So you might put the histology in. So adenoid cystic is the histology. So other people might put in salivary duct carcinoma, for instance, or mucoepidermoid carcinoma, acidic cell carcinoma. So that's the equivalent term. You might put salivary cancer in, or you might put salivary in and see what it comes back with. So the more general your word is, the wider you're casting your net. But if you cast your net wider, you're less likely to miss things. So this must be from our previous talk in Sheffield. It's already pre-populated. So if you put salivary cancer in and search, you're going to get, I would imagine, a larger number, 480 instead of 100 and odd. So there's filters here on the left, and I need to try and scroll down the screen a bit. Yeah.
On the right. Yeah.
Okay, I'll just scroll down. So you can just see this tiny box. There might be a way of making it easier to see more, but it's fine. So you can narrow it down to, so in salivary cancer, from not yet recruiting or recruiting. So you might think, well, look, I'm only really interested in trials that are recruiting. But actually some people might not be. Within this patient group, I know a lot of people are quite informed about trials that are in development or trials that have stopped recruiting, but they might have been in a phase 1 or 2, so they've done the dose finding, they've seen a signal, they've now stopped recruiting, and it's a conversation we're often having in clinic saying, oh, well, we've got a signal in drug X, we're actually hopeful that it's going to roll on to a phase 2 next year. And so actually looking for trials that are not yet recruiting sometimes has sense. And then you can look through these other things here, other filters. I think you would always want to just, no trials of drug therapies would sort by sex. Age is important. I mean, so a lot of trials still have as an inclusion criteria the word adult. So drugs are tested in adults. And I know it's not common, but if you get a salivary gland cancer and you're under the age of 18 and then looking for a drug trial, that can be really challenging. So you do have this option here about looking at by age. You've got phases, so Emma sort of highlighted this about phases of trials before. So just to kind of reiterate, so it goes phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. Phase 1 is the very first phase of a drug's development. So it's the first time you give a drug to a human. A first-in-human study is the very first, the very start point of a phase 1 study. So, if you think about it, at any new drug, at some point, someone has to be the first human in the world to have that drug. So that is a phase 1 first-in-human. And actually, for patients with salivary gland cancers, it's worth thinking about what phase 1 studies really involve, because these are the studies that actually most patients end up going into, because phase 1 studies, typically they don't restrict down their recruitment based on either histology, so adenoid, cystic or salivary duct, or nor do they restrict recruitment based on anatomy. So they don't say head and neck or salivary or breast or bowel. They often use the word any solid tumour, and that's in the title of so many of these phase 1 studies. And when they say solid tumour, that's a bit of a random word as well. It means not a blood cancer, not a leukemia. So anything that's not a leukemia is just called a solid tumour. And so many, if not most, phase 1 studies are for patients with any solid tumour. And so, it's something we always say, and there's a real lack of research opportunities for patients with salivary cancers. Well, actually, there are research opportunities. There's actually quite a lot. There's a lot of phase 1 studies, but they're just, they aren't the best option when it comes to drug trials. Phase 2 and in fact phase 3 are better options, but the options predominantly sit within phase 1. So a few things to think about phase 1. One is, if it's first in human, the other language that's often used in the title of the study is dose finding, dose escalation, looking for safety and tolerability. So these words are just normally the words in all the titles of phase 1 study. The only word that differs is the name of the drug. So it's a first in human dose finding study evaluating safety and tolerability of drug X in patients with any solid tumour. And that's, that is just a repeated title in most of these phase 1 studies. The way they work is, you start at a fraction of the estimated effective dose and gradually increase the dose as more patients are recruited onto the study. So most patients, if you go into a phase 1 study, you want to be asking these sorts of questions of the study team. Is it a phase 1 dose finding study? If so, where is it up to? Is this cohort 1, i.e. the first 3 patients having this tiny dose, or is it, say, cohort 8 or 10, which is often, there often only are about 8 or 10 cohorts. What are the side effect profiles? So some drugs are kind of another version of an existing drug, so we kind of have a really reasonable idea what the side effect profile might be, but some are entirely a whole new class of drugs. So it's a really relevant question just to know, of the patients on this study so far, which might only be 15 patients, how have they got on the study? Because actually, as someone going into a phase 1 study, this is going to impact on you. You're the next person in line potentially, who is going to take the chance of experiencing side effects from the drug. And the other obvious question that I'm sure everyone would want to know is, of the patients on drugs so far, has anyone benefited? And so that's the other thing you would ask. I think the other thing is there a clear rationale for this drug in my cancer? And a rationale helps, say, one patient rather than another probably will be best suited for this trial, and it will give you more confidence as a patient to go into a phase 1 study. But a rationale remains just a rationale. So this is stuff that's come out of all of this preclinical or translational research, all the stuff that's gone on in the labs, studying, say, tumour cells in a dish or in a mouse, or studying patient tumour samples or patient blood samples, gives you an idea, gives you what you might call a scientific rationale that this drug is this drug might work in this patient group, and that's why the study is then happening. And so in adenoid cystic carcinoma, for instance, I think many people know in this community, MYB is the gene that has most commonly gone wrong in adenoid cystic carcinoma. And there's a sort of new class of drugs that have just gone through or just going through their phase 1 studies, which are called MYB degraders. And so that you think, oh, well, that sounds like it's the right sort of thing. And it does. It's got a good scientific rationale. So these drugs target the MYB, not the MYB gene, but what the gene then produces, this bit of RNA, sort of targets that and tries to pull it down to normal levels. So in adenoid cystic, the levels are too high, and you try and normalize the levels. And if that is the primary problem that's gone wrong in the cells, then by normalizing it, the hope is you stop those cells growing and dividing, and that is essentially cancer, growth and division that's not controlled. And certainly a lot of the conversations we have in clinic are about exactly these drugs at the moment. And many patients are, SGC UK were involved in one of these trials in terms of putting input into the trial design and the patient information. And the two studies that are currently looking in adenoid cystic are MYB degraders in phase 1, kind of coming to the end of their phase 1, and we're at that point now where will they become a phase 2, 3? Will they expand out to need larger numbers of patients, and will they become kind of international studies that might be available for us? So phase 1 though is the area to sort of focus on. But I wouldn't then disregard others, phase 2, phase 3. And then here's study type. So it's worth thinking about this, and kind of what we talked about right at the start when I said, look, research isn't just drug studies, and it's not just it's not just in the areas where we really know there's a black box and we don't know what's going on. So observational studies are when you collect kind of outcome data. You're just looking at your patients, what treatment have they had, what are the outcomes? And you can sort of do that in two ways. A lot of our research is done through our biobanking, where we collect the same information actually, and individuals do consent to that. But you can also run it through clinical trials, which is slightly more complex to do, but give you the same output. So observational studies, patient registries are listed here as a type of study. And then interventional, so that means you're doing something, which might be drug, it might be surgery, it might be something else. And so it might be that you might say, I'm just interested in interventional studies for the purpose of if you're searching, to try and narrow things down. And then some are with or without results, and then you can also narrow down by other things like protocols. So I think we'll change our search term just to look then into what we get. So, because this had 480 for salivary, so let's just try and narrow it down a bit. So if we put adenoid cystic carcinoma, REM, was it 422? Is that? Okay, you get one study. So and it's the same as any kind of search database, isn't it? If you put very specific things in, you're going to get a very specific study. You almost have to, I mean, as you can, REM42, you've got to kind of know what you're searching for to find that. So this is one of the MIB degraders. So maybe just to go back a step, if you put adenoid cystic carcinoma and MIB, you get 7 studies. So actually, this is, and over time, these things will be time bound. REM422 is currently being studied, but won't be for in 5 years' time or whatever. So, but MIB, I think, in adenoid cystic will continue to be studied even after this study has finished. It will still be, something that we'll be studying. So, so there you get 7 studies, but the first one is the same study. So if you can then click into the study and get more information about them, you see. So this is its unique identifier, study details. So it then tells you some details about the study, which, for some people, they'll just say, I don't want that information. But I know from conversations that I have in clinic with our patient group, most of them, this is in their head. They do have this information. They're a very invested population, I suppose, so they really want to know stuff. And they read this, and this almost becomes the sort of the start point for understanding the disease. And I think that's a lot of doctors do that. If you look at our understanding of biology, I don't understand much about the microbiome. I mean, almost nothing about it, and that's because it doesn't form a central part of my practice. So I sort of don't need to. I don't do all that reading about the microbiome, whereas I know a lot about MIB as a gene, how it goes wrong and what it does when it goes wrong and what effects it has on the cell and how you might drug that. So it gives you a description of the study, and then it tells you where the locations are. And so this is obviously relevant if you are thinking, and this might be, obviously here, this is in the US, and that's what I was sort of saying. France is on here, I think it's not yet recruiting, it says. If a study is open in the UK, all the sites in the UK will be listed. And it's sometimes I will be looking, I'll be talking to my patients, where do you live? And then find a study in the UK. And actually, it's a very relevant question, because if you are on a phase 1 study, I think you want to go to the nearest available trial unit. Everyone is following the same trial protocol, so you're not going to get different kind of knowledge from the trial perspective from one centre to another. All investigators on early phase trials, particularly, they'll have fortnightly safety calls. So they all dial into the same meeting. They all present and update their experience at their site, and they run through all the side effects that they're seeing. So every centre pretty much that's recruiting will have the same knowledge. And actually, the practicalities of running a phase 1, they're transferable across all of these sorts of studies. So the bottom line is, I think going to a local trial centre really is the right thing. And just the practicalities, some studies are every week. If you're going every week and it's a 45-minute journey versus a 3-hour journey, the 45-minute journey is what you need. So it tells you where it's recruiting. It then has the eligibility. So sometimes I have this conversation with my patients as well about eligibility criteria, and because you sort of have to, sometimes people, they're not eligible for a trial, and actually the right thing to do is say that when rather than have people thinking it might be, so you can look for other options. And so if you look here, this is really nice to see, for instance, and it's actually specified histologically confirmed adenoid cystic carcinoma, any site of origin. And this is a real thing, as we've discussed a lot in this patient group, you've got adenoid cystic of the major salivary gland, which is these parotid, sublingual, submandibular, but that's the minority of adenoid cystic carcinoma. There's the minor salivary glands, all these other structures in the mouth and throat and nasal passages and airway, and then actually you get it in other secretory glands, as the tear gland, the breast, in the skin. And so actually the study permitting any site for our patients is really helpful. And it then lists other things on the criteria. So I think I would argue this is probably better for informing a discussion with your clinician, but actually most of the things here are probably things that you'll know whether they apply or not. And actually that list looks pretty comprehensive. So there's 13 inclusion and 21 exclusion criteria. Most trials are about that. You know, they've got a long list of rules that have to be, not rules, sorry, criteria that have to be met to be suitable. And then it tells you about the study design, the timelines, the readouts of the study, you know, what they're looking for. It's all these different readouts, who the investigators are, and then when the study was both registered and last updated. And then if there are study results as well, they go here. So at the moment, so there's study details, research view, and if there are results that are published, they go there. I would say the results aren't that complete on this website, to be honest. So there are a lot of studies that do have results, and the results for, I don't quite know why, aren't always on here, but sometimes they are. So that's a kind of walkthrough that, you know, this is for, I mean, it isn't just for clinicians, but clinicians use this. So we use it more, I think, for studies like this. We're just on top of these. There's a handful of studies in salivary cancers that we have a lot of conversations to work out what's going on. I think one other approach that's often applied is when we sort of profile tumours. So you use different methods of profiling, but often looking at DNA, looking for mutations, to try and use whatever you find to match people. So again, you're finding this rationale, this logic to say, let's try this drug, because it might be a particular mutation, and that drug might target that mutation that's something other than MIB, say. So those trials, you know, this is really open-ended. There's loads of trials, and you've got things like the Determine study, and so you might have one trial that's got a whole load of different options in it, different drugs and different targets, but there's a whole load of other trials. So newly developed targeted therapies, most of them are actually not in studies like Determine. They're just on their own, having their own study, their own phase 1 study. But that's where, for me, it is really useful then to know. You can put in the specific gene name, and it's a bit of time spent, but you can search and find out what is happening in the world for this specific molecular change in this specific patient's tumour, and where are we up to. So that's probably I'll probably stop the walkthrough there. But I mean, I would encourage people to use it, but to be, you know, just to be cautious when they're interpreting it. You'll get false positives and false negatives, so you might think there's nothing there when there is. And that might be because the search terms misled you, you know, for whatever reason, the search terms were too narrow or too focused, or a spelling mistake or something, I don't know. And so there might be a trial there that you've not found. It could be the opposite way. You might think there's a trial there, but there's not. And so particularly that's most likely to be around these eligibility criteria, really. Or I suppose it might say it's recruiting, but it's not, because it's not being updated. So do be aware that there'll be kind of false positives and false negatives with trials. But I do think, you know, if you've seen something online and someone is, or a patient you've met here, or, you know, who said, I've been on a drug trial, and you want to know more about that drug trial, this is, I would say, it's an authoritative resource to tell you more about the drug trial. So if you find something on it, then it is the US government website. You know, it's well maintained.